Good afternoon and welcome to UK Column News. It's Friday the 20th of March 2015 and this effectively is a special edition news because unfortunately we had some hardware, some technical problems this morning. Those have been sorted out but leaving us little time. So this effectively is a fill-in for the UK Column News, and what we've decided to do is focus on events north of the border. So I'm here joined by David Scott, and we're going to have a look at some of the events in Scotland, and then we'll cover just a couple of interesting items that are happening worldwide and in the rest of UK. And if you want to know about the weather, well, it's sunny and really quite nice in Plymouth, and I think that's about the same for the rest of the country. And we even managed a bit of sunshine this morning to have a look at that fascinating eclipse. Well, there we are. Let's see whether we've got David Scott with us. David, are you there?
Yes, Brian, I'm here.
Okay.
And, everything's working.
That's excellent. We seem to be getting back to normal, but I must say that this morning was quite an interesting experience. If people are thinking that dirty tricks were going on, we don't think so. It was just simply one of the boards failing in one of our computers. Well, let's have a look at Scotland then, and we've got Ms Sturgeon is being put in the spotlight over oil revenues. Over to you, David.
Yes, Nicola is not really owning up to any more of an error here than the rest of the world. The whole world was wrong, and we were just going along with it. Does that not sound a wee bit like Gordon Brown? Maybe not. The problem is the nationalists gave us a white paper, a big thick white book that would you could use to hold your door open with before the independence referendum. And the figures that they were claiming for oil revenues per year were in the order of, where are we now? 7.6 billion with a B, which is rather a lot of money. And what we're actually getting this year is not 7.6 billion, but something like 600 million. So we were out, there were 13-fold overestimate on oil revenues from the North Sea to a possible Scottish exchequer in an independent Scotland, or if they have full fiscal autonomy to their coffers. So this has left an enormous hole in Scotland's finances. We, as a country as a whole, the United Kingdom has a deficit of 4%. Scotland's deficit is now 8.6%, which is enormous and is getting up to IMF Greek-type levels of deficit. So there is a big problem here for the nationalists to answer. And of course, we're not seeing many answers. We're seeing extend and pretend, I think is the phrase.
This is fascinating. What's the excuse given for this? Did they put it down as a typo? Somebody simply typed in the wrong figure? Or is this accountancy massaging of figures?
It's groupthink. It's the fact that whenever people in government are doing financial projections, what they tend to do is they put on their rose-tinted glasses, they take where they're at and assume it gets slightly better into the future, and that's the projection. The economy, the world economy, is not like that. Certainly just now it's not like that. There are many potential horrible events sitting across the world, due in no small measure to debt and such products of the financial market as derivatives. And we're assuming that everything goes fine all the time, and then it doesn't. So we have a projection which was made, and in this, Nicola Sturgeon's excuse has got some merit. The British government got it wrong, and the Scottish government got it wrong, and the Scottish nationalists got it wrong. But these are all people in government, and governments tend to get these things massively wrong. They then have a level of expenditure being taxed from people, taxed out of the productive part of the economy, which in the good times is just about sustainable, and in the bad times is an enormous burden that can't actually be supported.
Just to digress, but it's all interesting about the picture that was put across to the general public in Scotland on the lead up to the referendum. But I read a newspaper article the other day. I think it was probably the Telegraph, but it was talking about a senior civil servant who had actually been phoning Scottish companies and effectively saying, well, you support the union. I think it's better if you remain quiet. Sorry to just
this is correct. It's not just a senior Scottish civil servant. This is the most senior Scottish civil servant. The head of the civil service in Scotland was making threatening phone calls to unionists supporting businesses, which is a very strange thing for anyone to do, but an even stranger thing for a civil servant to do when he's meant to be neutral. And it does raise the question as to how neutral the civil service actually is. One of the points that was made very strongly by the people campaigning against the ID cards is the ID cards had been a favourite route of the civil service for a long time. There had been an attempt to introduce them across the UK during the Blair government. That failed. But the idea never left the civil service. So when the new nationalist government came in, the civil servants were selling these ideas to the politicians. How much of that's correct, I really don't know, but it's an interesting point that is the civil service neutral, or is the civil service actually working to a specific agenda? And if so, what is it?
Yeah. Well, something I picked up from that article was that there wasn't any mention of misconduct in public office. As you say, the civil servant, certainly the top civil servant, should be scrupulously unpolitical, unbiased in carrying out their duties. And here they were not only being biased, but they were being upfront and aggressive about it. To me, that was a charge of misconduct in public office. But nobody seems to mention these offences against civil servants and people in the public sector who are not only failing to do their job, they're doing something which is an offence against the rules of their job.
Yes, we do see this. We do see this time and time again. The very tragic, and it's very difficult to watch, a video that you have on the feed of the police officers and social workers breaking into somebody's house and stealing their child, with a screaming child and screaming mother, and just the sheer horror and terror of the entire event. What we're seeing there is people who are meant to uphold the law behaving in an entirely unlawful manner, and yet they seem to get away with it. There's never any price, at least at the moment, to be paid. The civil servants have a duty. In Scotland, we have a common law crime called breach of duty, which is similar to malfeasance in public office in England. We don't see anybody getting prosecuted, however. Remember, in Scotland, all prosecution, bar 3 in the last 115 years, comes through the Crown Office. So it's very much a state-controlled access to that sort of justice.
Well, we'll move on from there towards to an article which is talking about the cult nature of the SNP. And I was particularly interested in this one because the article relates to Scotland. The cult of the SNP is driven by fantasy politics, but we're introducing the word of cult into politics. Of course, this brought me straight on to my early days of warning about the political charity Common Purpose and the fact that it was getting into politics, the public sector, schools, education, everywhere, and effectively training, reframing people to the new political agenda. And in the early days, I did meet people who'd been involved with Common Purpose who said to me, well, it's rather cult-like. And here we are all of a sudden having a look at Scottish politics and saying, well, we've got the SNP seemingly behaving in a bit of a cultish way. And we've had previous criticisms that this, of course, was what life inside New Labour was like. So what exactly are you seeing with the SNP north of the border?
Yeah, there certainly is a pseudo-religious element to quite a lot of British politics. Certainly, the left-wing politics. There's a lot of pure belief in there that it doesn't stand up to rational analysis, and as a result, you get people who will not engage in rational discussion. The SNP bring a particular flavour to it. Now, obviously, when you're talking about cult-like, you're only talking about some members of the party behaving in this way, but there is a certain cult of leader about the SNP for a start. Now, that surrounds very much Alex Salmond and nobody else. They really don't have anyone who commands that sort of loyalty. Nicola Sturgeon certainly doesn't, and John Swinney and the rest of them don't. So it's very much surrounding Salmond. So though Nicola was on Women's Hour today on Radio 4, telling the world how she was the boss, and when it comes to negotiating with Ed Miliband, she's going to be the person in the room. The person who carries the emotional leadership of the Nationalists is very certainly Alex Salmond. There's a few other aspects of this that are quite worrying. I think there's a very interesting article. It was prompted, this is by Alan Cochrane in the Telegraph. It was prompted by the North Sea oil revenues again, the 13 times overestimate. So the Nationalists were expecting 8 billion, he says here, and they're getting less than 1. But he points out that none of these gross mistakes seem to reflect in the polls, that there seems to be a belief and trust in the Nationalists amongst their supporters that is unshakable by any rational argument or evidence. And on the flip side of that, in Scotland, there is an anti-nationalist feeling which is becoming more crystallised as well, based on criticisms of them on the grounds of fiscal irresponsibility and statist tendencies. So we're actually seeing Scotland become, relatively speaking, divided on political grounds where it really wasn't before, not to this extent. And it also brings up certain aspects of the nationalist view of Scotland and what they've been trying to push on us or sell to us. Which have, if not cult-like tendencies, certainly they're very non-specific. You'll see, if we get to Alex Salmond's book and what was actually on offer, we were told we were going to, well, not be free. Free wasn't the word that was used. We were going to be independent. We were going to have an independent parliament, and it was going to sort everything. And there was not really any intelligent discussion as to how that would happen or why that would happen. It seemed to be resting on the idea, and it's a very, very dangerous idea, and it's an idea that's afflicted America for a very long time, perhaps the whole of its history, that Scotland is somehow the exceptional nation, or the exceptional wee nation, and America is the exceptional great nation. And this is a very dangerous thing to believe of yourself or of your people, because you then start to do some very nasty things, because you can't be right. You can't be wrong because you're exceptional. You must be right. It's a political version of Robert Burns's famous poem, Holy Willie's Prayer, where Holy Willie is quite clearly anything but holy, but because he considers himself as chosen by God, he can't actually err.
Well, that's a pretty interesting statement on where Scotland may be heading. Of course, one of the key player who's driven the agenda, the political agenda north of the border, here he is, Mr. Alex Salmond. And as you've just mentioned, he's produced a book. It says it's drawing crowds. How does he manage to do all of his political manoeuvring and write a book? These people seem to be superhuman. Or could somebody have shadow written it for him? What do you think?
Are you suggesting that there's a Scottish politician who's not entirely honest with the public? Shame on you. Alex Salmond's book is The Dream Will Never Die. Well, a couple of things on that. There are those of us in Scotland who are awake, and we don't want to be dreaming, we want to be thinking. But I think my main point about this is it's the sort of language it's used. It's like Obama in America. What he sold was change. So change can mean 1,000 things to 1,000 different people. Change means whatever you want it to mean. Ultimately, change means nothing. It was devaluing the language. A dream that will never die. Well, everyone's got a dream, and what does it mean? Well, it means something different to everybody. So ultimately, it means nothing. If Scotland is to be self-governing, well, what does that mean? I mean, what standard of government? What degree of freedom? Scotland, when the King moved down to London, he took the court with him. We had 100 years where we still had a parliament after that. Then the parliament moved down to London, and Scotland was largely not governed by political means. Actually, it was the judiciary. It was the Lord Advocate that actually ran the place. And any major decisions that were made by the judiciary. And that's why the Northern Lighthouse Board, for example, is run by a whole series of judges. Because at the time, 17th, 18th century, when the lighthouses were being built, that was the major state involvement in the economy. The judiciary in Scotland ran it. Now, this was a time when the state was very small, and most people, until they went to the post office, had no interaction with the state at all. So people were, relatively speaking, free. And what we had in Scotland is relatively free people. We had a free banking system, or as close as anyone's ever managed. We had enormous amounts of capital accumulation, and we had a great economic boom that lasted for several hundred years, and we also had an educational boom that the like of which really has never been seen. So we did very, very well when we were not particularly ruled by anybody. Freedom seemed to work quite well for Scotland. Now, if we are being offered freedom, well, that's one thing. But if we're being offered a state control rule, but with a kilt on it, that's something else entirely.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's the state rule that's coming, and what better headlines to put on screen next than these talking about armed police in Scotland. So we've got the Telegraph here. Scotland's armed police stop drink drivers, and then we've got accidental firing of weapons taking place, negligent discharges as they're usually called. And I'll put up the next one as well. We've also got here Police Scotland receiving 27 complaints over its policy of armed officers since May. This is in your face, isn't it? That Sir Stephen House seems to be defying everybody. He's defying members of the Scottish Parliament. He's defying communities. They are saying we're concerned about armed police officers on patrol when we can't see any need for it. And Sir Stephen House simply says, yeah, okay.
Police Scotland have gone through several attempts at explaining this. The first one was, well, we're Police Scotland. This is what's happening. Suck it up. That didn't go down well. So we've then had essentially lying. That's not worked. They've got caught on that. So we're now into several versions of PR spin. They had another session in the Scottish Parliament yesterday. It was very, very funny to watch. The use of language is fascinating. Guns are not called guns by Police Scotland. They're called conventional weapons, which makes me wonder what unconventional weapons they got. I thought initially, has Police Scotland got a nuke? But no, I think they're talking about pepper spray and tasers. But they're not. They won't say firearm. They won't say gun. They won't say Glock 17. They call them, in official language, conventional weapons. Now, here's the deal. There are cars with armed police officers roaming Scotland. And when I say roaming, they do something called patrol matrix is the official language. And what a patrol matrix is, what you or I would call swanning around. So they drive around with the guns, and if there is a call for a police response via the police central radio dispatch, they will only be called if there is some sort of threat to life. So if your cat is stuck up a tree and you call the police and the police radio for a response, then that message won't go to the armed response vehicle, even though it might be very good at getting the cat out of the tree. But if they happen upon some sort of wrongdoing, be it a pub fight or a failure to indicate right at a junction or drunk driving or whatever they happen to be, then it's left up to the individual officers to decide, using their discretion, what they're going to do about it. So 1 in every 100 fixed penalty notices in Scotland is now issued by an armed officer. So they are getting involved in pub fights and drunk driving and this sort of thing. And the fact that they're out there is justified because of the alleged threat of organised crime, which is no doubt real, albeit very rare in Scotland. We don't see exactly a lot of gunfights in the average day. And also by the threat of terrorism. Now, I would suggest that the threat of terrorism is so small that the threat of police officers discharging their weapons by accident is probably a greater threat to the public than actually the terrorists are.
Well, that brings a smile to my face. Black humour, of course, but we had a negligent discharge by a firearms officer in Nottinghamshire Police, and they'd invited a group of school children to come and see how the police do their job. And in fact, the young girl, very, very lucky. She wasn't seriously injured, but in fact, she was hit by the ejected cartridge. But what it shows is that these firearms police are actually dangerous individuals. And my black humour is that we've been told by very good sources that David Cameron's been calling on the military police to provide him with close protection. I think Mr. Cameron's getting very worried about something. But alongside the military police, apparently Royal Navy servicemen and women have been called in for weapons training for close protection. And I'm allowed to say, as a former Royal Navy man, that a sailor with a weapon, extremely dangerous. So, Mr. Cameron, I wish you the best with that, but there we go. Well, just a quick comment on this remarkable story of armed Scottish police stopping a 91-year-old man. Clearly, did he have a big beard? Was he mistaken for ISIS or something?
I don't think it was a beard-related issue. The 91-year-old man was proceeding in a northerly direction on the A9. He was surrounded by multiple armed response vehicles. No fewer than 4 policemen jumped from their cars and unholstered their weapons and pointed their Glock 17s at the 91-year-old man, who was somewhat surprised. They then bundled him out of the car, handcuffed him, and kept him hanging around on the roadside for 20 minutes until another police unit showed up to actually charge him and take him away to the police station, when it was found that he had, in fact, done nothing. 6 hours later, it was found that he had actually done nothing, and there was no reason for this response. Somebody had made a report that they thought he was a danger, but it was simply one phone call by someone who had got either the wrong end of the stick or was being malicious, I don't know. And this whole thing played out in the full view of the rush hour traffic in the A9 heading towards Inverness.
Yeah. Very, very, very serious things. Well, I'll just bring this in very quickly. I won't dwell on it, but we're getting more and more reports of military personnel, both in the States and indeed in UK, being trained in urban warfare. Now, we know that there are policy decisions which say, well, OK, military engagements overseas, if it's been in Iraq or even Afghanistan, predominance of urban areas, so they need to be trained. But what is unnerving people is they're starting to say, well, we've got increasingly heavily armed police. The police are becoming militia-like. And then we've got the troops who are now being brought into urban areas for training. And it's almost as if they're working to a blurring of the boundaries between the police and the military. And I'll just add to that, we should not forget, of course, that the police in France, for example, are actually a component of the French military. So if we see Britain's police hobnobbing with their European counterparts, we should in fact be pretty concerned that our civilian police are being slowly militarised. Just a quick comment on that, and then we need to move on to some other subjects.
Yes, I would point out that the police in Scotland and in England are ever more military in appearance. The black uniforms, the stab vests, all the rest of it, they look very threatening. And this is not something that promotes a lot of goodwill, the sort of goodwill that used to exist as far as the police is concerned. And it's being eroded, and it's very sad, and it's very important that the police are able to police by consent. And what we're seeing here is that being broken down, certainly in Scotland. Yeah.
Well, of course, everything that's happening, be it the arming of police or whatever, is being done on the back of the fact that we're in a financial crisis. We've got to cut back on public spending, and therefore that is the excuse underpinning most of the decisions we're seeing at the moment. But you chose this article here, LewRockwell.com, the financial folly lurking beneath Yellen's patient lack of impatience. I said to you a little bit before the start of the programme, this one's definitely yours. What have you got to tell us about this one?
Well, this is from David Stockman, who's always worth a read and worth a listen. He's an ex-Washington insider, so he knows what's going on and the sort of decisions they're making. And he finds what's happening now increasingly ridiculous, because we have a situation where the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and every other central bank in the world is committed to zero interest rate policy, or indeed sometimes negative interest rate policy. So there's no interest rates at all. So that means that there's not going to be much capital accumulation, without which there's not going to be much capitalism. And they keep pretending it's not the case. So it becomes now a language game. So the Fed are saying if they use the word patience, then that signals it's going to be 9 months to a rate rise. And if they take the word patience out, it might only be 3 months, and that's what the code means. And it's just nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. They can't raise rates without causing an enormous implosion in the United States and world economy. They have got to the end point of their policies, and there's nowhere for them to go. None of the levers that Nicola Sturgeon says she wants to control, but because that would be good for Scotland, none of these levers are connected to anything anymore. None of it works. It's all basically a figment of Janet Yellen's imagination.
Okay, well, we're going to move south of the border, and this is one of a number of headlines which I'm going to describe as horrific. It's the Mail reporting on the abuse of the two youngsters, 8 and 9, in Hampstead. And after a series of secret family court cases, which I will just comment on separately, all of a sudden we've had a judgment by Mrs. Justice Palfrey, and the papers are now screaming. Look at the headline here, pictured the mother who tortured her 2 children to lie about a satanic child sex cult based at a primary school to get back at her ex in custody dispute. The mother forced the children to lie. They named the children. She said the couple may have, notice the language, may have fed the children cannabis soup to gain compliance. And more than 4 million people have viewed the fantasy material online. Now, what is interesting about this case is well, I'll start off by stating that I have personally met the mother and the partner. I do not have any doubts at all about what the mother and her partner have said about the abuse of those 2 children. I'm very happy to make that statement. We have then seen the children within 24 hours taken away from the mother into the custody of local social services, Barnet. We have seen police officers threatened by other Metropolitan Police officers to get them away from the case. And then we have seen a series of court cases, secret, under the family court rules. So the only people inside those court proceedings were the legal teams for local authorities, social services, the police, of course, the mother and her partner having to defend themselves. They did have some legal representation. But following a series of secret court cases, we then have a public statement by the judge, Mrs. Justice Palfrey, and she says, well, general public in Britain, whole thing, complete and utter pack of lies, which many people have said, well, this is very interesting, Ms. Palfrey, because online was published the medical report in which a very experienced doctor examined both the children and stated categorically that both these children had been seriously sexually abused. Now, in her statement, the judge simply doesn't deal with this matter, but what we now know from people who were present in court is that there was an attack on the medical doctors to say, well, actually, your report wasn't really correct, was it? So we are now in Britain, 2015, where there is a serious sexual attack on children, the whole proceedings held behind closed doors, and then one single judge releases a statement to the press, and suddenly her version, which I'm going to say is an outrageous version of the truth, is then released, and we should all believe it. And what is worse, this judge has said to the general public, if you're somebody who viewed the children giving on-camera evidence as to what has happened to them, if you're somebody in the public who's viewed it, you're actually pretty close to being a paedophile yourself, and certainly you're evil. So we have got secret courts now where people are talking about serious sexual assault, and we've got a statement by one judge, we should believe her. What's your take on it, David?
It really is an incredible situation. On one level, in Scotland, it keeps throwing up parallels to the Holly Gregg case, because we have a single judge making a decision. We have the official line being, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to see here. It must be the mother who put her/them up to it. Oh, she's just trying to get back at her ex-husband. All of this is straight out the Holly Gregg playbook. And we've then got, well, what about all the medical evidence? Well, let's not talk about the medical evidence. It's ridiculous. This single judge, we had a wee look, a colleague of mine had a look for some information and came across a blog written by someone who's very key in the Fathers for Justice movement, who had the pleasure of being under the tender mercies of this judge, and who wrote a very heartfelt defence of his position of liberty, and basically said that there's one child abuse scandal in this country bigger than institutional paedophile abuse, and that is the family courts, the secret family courts in England, who have been harming and abusing in their own tender ways tens of thousands of children now in all across the country. And it's a situation that will eventually be revealed, and when it is, the judges responsible are going to be in serious trouble, because the whole thing is just a catalogue of official abuse of the individual. As far as the children are concerned, the medical evidence was extremely compelling, and the fact that police officers are being threatened not to investigate this. We've just been through a year of revelations about how this happened. Oh, but it's all in the past. In the 70s, yes, but it's in the past. In the 80s, yes, but we're not doing that anymore. In the 90s, yes, but it's in the past. And here it's now happening live, and nobody notices, it would appear, in the mainstream media or in officialdom, that we're running the same scenario one more time.
Yeah, this is a very key point that you've raised, that if you look at the spin in the media, the press, it's always this is something that took place in the past. And indeed, I spoke on the telephone this morning with Oxfordshire Child Safeguarding Board because they're boasting on their website they've got a special pledge, a promise that if anyone contacts them with knowledge about child abuse, they will get onto the case, they will look into it. So I called them and I said, of course, they had never properly investigated the abuse that took place at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. Indeed, there's a provable cover-up. There was collaboration in that cover-up between Oxfordshire City, County Council, the college and Thames Valley Police. And I said, so does your pledge extend to Oxford and Cherwell Valley College victims? And I have to say, a very nice lady said that she would go away and talk to one of the senior managers who would call me back. But I'm afraid to say, I don't think there was a call back. I may have missed it. I will certainly be checking up. But I think this is just a scam that's being put across. It's all in the past. And we're making procedural changes. We're not going to bring people into court to bring the full force of the law to bear on abusers. We're just going to make procedural changes. Now, in this particular case, the Hampstead case, it's very interesting that the judge is actually the same lady judge who very early on dealt with Anne and Holly Gregg. And I have to say that this was the lady at one stage that tried to get Anne Gregg, the mother, and Robert Green into the court with no representation to protect them. And she was very insistent on this until Robert very bravely said, well, under the equity at law, we both can have the same defence present, representation present. What you're doing is not right. And I'm pleased to say that Anne and Robert stuck to their guns, and eventually this judge backed down and their legal advisors were allowed into the hearing. And I can speak with authority on this because I was one of those people. Now, there was a complaint made as a result of her action that either she didn't know the law or she was attempting to pervert the course of the law by bringing these two very vulnerable people into a closed court. So early on, fascinating to see what took place around Anne and Holly Gregg. And of course, Robert receives a gagging order for a year. And here we have this couple who I sat down and talked to for several hours. And I warned them of what would take place. And that would be, there would be an inversion of the case and they would become the targeted individuals while the state closed down. I'll just end by saying that a person who was present in this latest hearing that resulted in Mrs. Justice Palfrey's judgment said it was an extraordinary scene inside the court because there was a vast number of people representing the local authorities, as say CAFCAS and social services and the police. The court was full of people representing the state to the extent the atmosphere was extremely heavy and unpleasant. And the person said, I thought I was amongst the witches' coven in that court. So just, it's outrageous what's been printed. The UK column is going to stay on the case. We think public attention should be focused on this particular judge and the outrage which is Britain's secret courts in 2015. So more on that next week. But we'll just end on this very interesting article from the Telegraph. It says that Britain has revived Margaret Thatcher's free market fund in the struggle against Vladimir Putin. Well, I was quite puzzled by this initially because I thought at the moment Britain was desperately short of money, which is why we're cutting our armed forces, for example. But apparently David Cameron has unveiled the successor to Margaret Thatcher's, we just highlight it here, Know-How Fund to help the Balkans resist Russian influence. Now, many people will not know the significance of this article, but we're going to say, please get onto the UK Column website and have a look at the article we wrote, which was called BBC Media Action Subversion from Broadcasting House to Kazakhstan. And if you read the article, where we take an in-depth look at the BBC and their political charity Media Action, we've got this wonderful section here where a man is saying that the Know-How Fund was launched against the Soviet Union, the British government's programme of support for economic and political reform, and this led to this very, very nasty programme, the BBC Marshall Plan of the Mind. And this is where BBC propaganda was going to be used to help change people's views and values in the former communist states. So we are looking at David Cameron now unleashing money, public money, from a very desperate UK as part of a subversive attack on effectively the minds of people in Eastern Europe. But of course, it's really targeted on causing trouble for the Russians. I want to say outrageous. I don't know what you might think of this one, David.
Very strange. I wasn't aware that the BBC and the British government had any principles or message to actually sell to the Russians. What would it be this time? Because is Russia any less free than we are here? If I want to see different viewpoints put forward, contrasting viewpoints, people having different ideas, some of which I'll agree with, some of which I won't. I turned on Russia Today, not the BBC. There's certainly political influence in Russia Today, but it's less pervasive than we have in the Beeb. It's less standardised. There are more different voices allowed. There are voices from the West that I can hear on Russia Today that I can't hear on the BBC. They'll be completely prohibited. They'll be censored out of existence. All this, freedom, free market stuff. We won't have any of that in the BBC. You can get it on Russia Today. How to try and compare this to a time when there was communist rule, oppressive military domination of all the satellite countries, and let's not forget the communists killed something like 1 in 5 of their own people in Russia to make sure that rule stuck. 20%, 45 million or thereby.
Yes, I believe that's the sort of figure. Yeah.
So we're talking about something that was incredibly oppressive. Now, that's not happening now. Whatever you want to say about Putin, and there's plenty to criticise Putin on, but we're not in a situation where there's that sort of level of differentiation between the West and the East. Not anymore. I'm sorry. And we've also got this idea that somehow we were instrumental in bringing down the Soviet regime. As far as I can tell, the CIA and MI6 discovered that the Soviet regime had fallen when they read about it in the paper. They didn't seem to have any advanced warning, but people in the freedom movement knew it was coming because they could see it happening, because you had people spreading ideas organically within numerous countries. Poland, for example, we're having sort of free market literature, economics textbooks essentially to talk about how you run an economy in a situation where there's freedom. We're being printed on underground presses and distributed, and the communist government in Poland couldn't stamp this out. They then threatened imprisonment. That didn't work. They then said that if they catch anyone with this illicit printed material, they would crush their cars. And all of the people who were printing up this free market literature clubbed together to set up an insurance syndicate in case anyone got their cars crushed. They called it Lloyd's of Warsaw. You know, it was a free market solution. It was all indigenous. The real work was done by the people themselves. It wasn't Britain and the West altering how people think. They give themselves too much credit, I think.
Well, there's certainly a lot of analysis to be done on what did go on inside Russia. One thing I'd like to say, if we have a look at President Putin, it's very clear that what he did do is kick out a lot of criminals and criminal oligarchs from Russia. Where did many of those people come? Well, surprisingly, it was London. And I think on that happy note, we will end there. David, thank you very much for giving us so much time this afternoon. We're delighted to be able to get this this news report up. So we've got something today. So thanks for joining us. I'll just say for people over the weekend, if you're finding events happening very, very fast, hang on to your hats, because I think we are going to see more exposure of the absolute criminality of British politicians and the establishment. And you need to stay focused on the subject of child abuse, because the paedophile rings are the means by which powers have been blackmailing and controlling the British establishment and political establishment. So child abuse is key. Get the lid off the child abuse and we can start to work to get our country back. And a big thank you to those very brave policemen and women who have finally started to stand up and be counted and are hammering the table now to say, of course, that when they investigated child abuse many years ago, it was their own senior officers that caved in and closed the investigations down on the orders of people, yes, from inside the very establishment and Westminster that were involved in the paedophilia in the first place. So if we crack the child abuse, we're well on our way to regaining control of our country. Well done, those policemen and women. We look forward to seeing you on Monday. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.